without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. George Karkazis, an attorney from Chicago, the current Secretary of Orthodox Christian Laity and a past president, who will conduct the interview and introduce Professor Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
We're really are excited, and we're honored to have Professor Kitroeff here with us. Dr. Kitroeff is an associate professor of history at Haverford College, where he teaches courses on modern history, modern European and Mediterranean history. He was born in Athens, Greece. He studied in Britain, where he received his doctor's degree in history at Oxford University. His research focuses on nationalism and ethnicity in modern Greece and its diaspora. He talks about the diaspora in terms of politics and sports. He's an author of 4 books, including The Greeks of Egypt, Ethnicity and Class, 1919 to 1937, which was published in 1989, it looks like. And he also published a book, Wrestling with the Ancients, Modern Greek Identity and the Olympics, which was published in 2004. So we already have his CV that you can take a look at, so we'll get right on with it. I'd like to introduce him and have him talk about his book a little bit.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really flattering when you write something and people are interested in what you write and want to discuss it. And let me also take the opportunity to underline how much my research benefited from the OCL and the OCL's writing and its existence and its views of Greek Orthodoxy. I couldn't imagine a history of Greek Orthodoxy in the 20th century and beyond, which would not mention the OCL. And I actually think that maybe future histories, which will be a little bit more specific or targeted or addressing one particular period or one particular topic, will actually talk about the OCL even more. What I want to do this evening is, before we go on to the questions and answers, and I hope that there'll be more questions as we go along, I wanted to share a very short 10 to 11 slide PowerPoint, which really just gives the story about how the book came about and very briefly what the book is about, or at least what I was hoping to achieve with the book, just so that we can frame our conversation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and go to my PowerPoint presentation and talk a little bit about how this book came about, as I said. So I'm as George Karkazis mentioned, I'm a historian of the Greek diaspora, and I never planned to write a book about the church, but I was historical consultant to a documentary which was called, it was 2007, The Journey, the Greek-American Dream by Maria Iliou, and I was the historical consultant. And that documentary had a huge, working with Maria Iliou and that documentary has had a huge impact on me, because I realized actually that documentaries are more effective than books sometimes in telling stories, because more people, it's accessible to more people. In the course of the documentary, and you see also a book came out in Greek with the photographs used in the documentary. In the course of the documentary, one of the beneficial things was that I had to explain to Maria Iliou in a very concise way many things about the Greek American community. And I found myself saying, the Greek Orthodox Church is the most important institution of Greek America. I said it 2-3 times. And we had Father George Stephanopoulos talk about the church, because Maria told me, well, good. So what are you going to say about the church? And I said, wait, I'm not, it's too important. Let's get someone who knows. And Father Robert Stephanopoulos, who we'll see in a minute, spoke about the documentary, about the church in the documentary. Then what happened was we had a premiere at the Benaki Museum in Athens, and then the US premiere took place in May 2007. And coincidentally, 2 people right after the premiere finished, the screening finished, we went off to have the dinner, and it was bizarre because we had the dinner where the ancient Egyptian temple is. But during that dinner, 2 people came up to me, Father Alex Karloutsos, who I think is known to everyone, and also the then General Consul of Greece to New York, Katerina Boura. I had met Katerina in England. We were graduate history students in England together. Katerina decided, wisely maybe, not to go into academia and followed a distinguished career in the Greek diplomatic service. Both of them told me, Alexandre, you need to write a book about Archbishop Iakovos. He's very important. No one's written a book about him. That got me going and thinking in terms about maybe a biography, maybe a general history about the church. And I felt I couldn't write a biography of Archbishop Iakovos because there was too much background and there was too much context not known. So that's why I chose to write this, which is an overview of the history of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese and its relations with the Greek American community. And we'll be more specific about that in a minute. When I was writing the book, I was extremely lucky to get a very generous grant from the Jaharis Family Foundation, which enabled me to stay in New York and work at the archives of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. This is a street sign from the village of Agia Paraskevi in Lesbos, where the Jaharis family originally emigrated from. Michael and Mary Jaharis are benefactors of many things, and I was very fortunate, thanks to the Jaharis Foundation, to be able to write the book. Without that grant, I don't think it would have been possible. My other benefactor was Father Robert, who at the time had retired. I choose my words carefully because maybe retired is not the right word, because he was asked to step down by Archbishop Spiridon, I think, in very controversial circumstances. But anyway, by the time I was researching in New York, he was retired, but he'd had his library at the school, which is next to the cathedral in New York. And I used to go down once a week and we used to hang out. He was generous with information, generous with his books, and it was very beneficial. The main research took place in the archives of the Archdiocese, and I was, in a sense, guided through those archives by the current archivist, Mrs. Nikki Calais, seen here in a red dress. Ms. Calais was for many years associated with Archbishop Iakovos, and after he retired, she is in charge of the archives. And together we strategized, and I realized it was a huge topic, and I focused on the clergy laity congresses. Those were the main documents that I saw. I also should mention, first of all, the archive is extraordinarily rich because it's got correspondence from parishes, it's got Greek American newspapers, it's got a HEPA correspondence, it's got stuff about the Greek American lobby, and it's all in PDF form thanks to the Niarchos Foundation. The Stavros Niarchos Foundation funded the, well, it's not quite digitization, but it's They were made into PDFs and are preserved. So this is just a summary of the book. It's about the Greek Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Greek Americans, the Greek Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Greek Americans. So, you know, I'm very much aware of the fact that not all Greek Americans are Greek Orthodox and not all Greek Orthodox are Greek Americans. But coming from the Greek diaspora field, I came there and was looking at their relations with the church. And it discusses and seeks to explain how the interrelationship evolved through the 20th century, especially from the 1930s onwards. So for what it's worth, I describe it as a social history of Greek Orthodoxy. Therefore, it is not a church history, nor is it a study of Greek Orthodox theology, nor is it a study of the increasing appeal of Greek Orthodoxy beyond the Greek American community. Where one field stops and the other one starts, don't ask me. I appreciate that I'm talking, there's a kind of fuzzy border that is, you know, one has to accept that one has to do a little bit of those other fields as well when one is doing a social history, and more about that later when we get to the questions. I was extremely indebted in terms of my methodology, in terms of my approach. I was inspired by Charlie Moskos's work very much, both in his research methods. I met him once in Astoria, and he went up to a quote unquote old calendarist church, which I found a very intimidating prospect. He just rushed up the stairs, started asking everyone he could find questions. I mentioned that in the acknowledgements. Wonderful, wonderful way of doing research. Writing, he wrote a very personality, people-oriented study of the Greek Americans. But most of all, I was influenced, and many scholars are, with his idea that is also reflected in Theodos Salutos's work about the Greek Americans assimilating over time. It's not a straight line, of course. It's not linear. There's back and forthness. There's people coming from Greece that stop that assimilation, or they stand out of the gradual assimilation. But there is this overlay shaping the Greek American experience, which is most certainly steady assimilation, incorporation into America. Concept of diaspora, which comes up in the questions here with Charlie, I have a different take. I'll mention it now and we can go over it again. Moskos talks about diaspora in terms of the way that the church defines diaspora, which, if I remember well, it's the establishment of the church beyond the lands which are already governed by existing patriarchates. I'm looking at diaspora more from a social history, Greek point of view, which makes diaspora really as a synonym of the Greeks abroad. So we have a slightly different concept of the diaspora, although I do agree with his main view that what was once the Greek diaspora is now quite clearly an American ethnic group. And with the Greek American ties with Greece, you know, I think I may have read more Greek sources, and maybe I'm interested more in the ties to begin with. So I identify more of a greater degree of connection with Greece than Charlie does in his work. Finally, just to not defend myself, but there were wonderful things about the social history of the church that I discovered as I was writing and I couldn't really cover. One is the role of women. This is an example of the women of the St. Eleftherios Church in Manhattan decorating the epitaphios. I tried to talk as much as I can about the women. It struck me as that a non-specialist audience would be very surprised by the fact that the church is male-oriented, but in many institutional ways, but women play such an important role. And I'm not only talking about the Philoptochos, I'm talking about this, about the festivals, about cooking in the festivals, about organizing all the activities that the churches do to fundraise. It seems to me that most of the work is done by women, and it's worth a book in itself. Finally, although technically the book ended in 1999, because I started working during Archbishop Dimitrios's tenure. Archbishop Dimitrios was appointed in 1999, and he generously gave me permission to look at the archives, and I felt a bit awkward writing a history about already existing archbishop. But by the time the book was published, which took some time, and finding publishers who were interested, and I thank the Northern Illinois University Press and Cornell University Press for their interest in the book. I did cover the period of Archbishop Dimitrios, and I think we all know that Archbishop Dimitrios was forced to step down because of the economic, financial irregularities associated with the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox National Shrine at the foot of the Twin Towers, which was destroyed during 9/11. But what I think in all the writing and controversy over that, I think people are missing a very important point, which is that the fact that the Greek Orthodox Church decides to reestablish St. Nicholas as a national shrine shows to me, I mean, that's, this is Charlie Moskos. This is showing that the church is becoming part of America. Almost, I could say, whether it likes it or not. It seems to me that this shows that the church is open to America by establishing a national shrine. And finally, Professor Vrionis, my mentor, used to say, whenever they asked him about the future of Hellenism or the future of Greece or whatever, he used to say, "You're asking the wrong person about the future. I'm a historian. I know about the past, not the future." However, I obviously, I was just finishing the corrections when the Archbishop Elpidophoros era began, and I speculate right at the end of the book that about what that might mean. Might it mean? I think it's complicated. The questions will give me my answers will give me a better opportunity to carefully expand on that, because it is the future, which I don't know much about. But it seems to me that the church might be entering an era, resuming the Americanization that was halted in the late 1990s, but it's done in a more careful, deliberate, calibrated way, with the direct input of the ecumenical patriarchate, which wasn't the case before. So that's my summary of the book. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to framing, and I'm happy now to get to the questions and answers.
Well, I'm gonna, based on what you said, I think I'm going to take some of these questions a little bit out of order, because you mentioned Professor Moskos, who wrote a chapter in the OCL book that was published in 1993 on faith, language, and culture. And in that, his conclusion in that was that if, quote, and I'm quoting from his book, if the Greek Orthodox Church in America were to emphasize secular ethnicity over sacred ethnicity, it might well end up in a situation where the descendants of the immigrants are neither Greek nor Orthodox. So based on, and I know that you're a historian and not looking forward, but based on your studies of the church here and the various personalities involved, how would you respond? I mean, what are your thoughts on his observation that he thought that if we push ethnicity over religion, we're going to end up with the descendants being neither one or the other?
In general, I most certainly agree with that. I think where I have a difference is that I see ethnicity as being hanging around more than Charlie Moscos did. And I agree that the church's investment in ethnicity, if it forgets religion and focuses on ethnicity, then it'll find itself neither here nor there. That I agree with, and I would even say even more that I think now that many people who are the descendants of Greek Americans, the identity that they have is more Greek Orthodox than Greek American. Nonetheless, I think there is still Greek ethnicity is relevant, obviously because there is a big number, still a significant size of the Greek American community who are Greek born. And we have this maybe not quite an anomaly, but a sociological phenomenon that a lot of Greeks come in the 1970s, which doesn't exist for other European ethnic groups. And that gives a Greek-based influx and inflection to the community, and they all gather in Astoria and a couple of other places and establish Greek language newspapers and media. So they have a disproportionate effect on Greek America, maybe because of their concentration. But the other thing is, I think the second and third generation retains ethnicity, but it's not the ethnicity of their parents. It may be a nostalgia, it may be a vague sense of heritage. I remember the US Census of 2000 didn't ask, what ethnicity are you? It said, do you consider yourself to have any ethnic heritage? And is it mixed or not? So I think sociologically, we live in an era in America where ethnic heritage is still relevant for many people, and that sustains Greek American ethnicity.
Professor Kitroeff, Pete Jaharis here. A follow-up question on sort of related themes. I'm a little curious how you're able to measure, and very specifically a potential for, I would call it myself, right? Which is a specific category. That do you have an ability to measure those of us as second or third generation Greek Orthodox Americans that have left the Greek Orthodox Church in favor for other Orthodox churches, right? So I would describe myself as my Greek heritage is very, very important to me, right? I'm the last generation of the quote unquote Greek purebred Jaharises, right? So, and I'm proud of that. I genuinely am, right? And my grandparents and everything. But I don't speak Greek. And so though I did grew up in a Greek Orthodox church, and when I was in Indianapolis, I spent years at a Greek church because it was predominantly English speaking. But when I moved to New Jersey, right, the Greek language drove me away from the church, right? Because my family doesn't speak Greek, and that's more important to my faith, that I'm in an Orthodox community that we understand. So with that as sort of a little bit of backdrop, I'm curious your ability to measure or identify people like me, right? That are gone from the Greek Orthodox Church. You know, quote unquote, I would say driven away, because it bothers me that when I came to New Jersey, you can't escape the Greek language. And I'm like, okay, you don't want me here. So I'm just sort of curious if you can measure those things.
Thank you for your question. If I may say so, yes, moving to New Jersey, yeah, you said it. You moved into a East Coast area with a huge, with where Greek is still used widely, at least, and obviously in the liturgy of the parish you initially may have visited, and therefore you were, yes, you turned away. I can understand that. How do I measure you? Actually, there's no way. I have no scientific way of measuring. But what I do is because of the documentaries, and I've done book tours, etc., to Greek American communities, I try and talk to as many people as possible in those meetings, and try and gauge whether they're members of the church or not, whether they speak Greek, whether they think in terms of ethnic terms or Orthodox terms or nothing else. So I think you're making a very good point that if someone is not in a parish, a Greek Orthodox parish, or any Greek American organization, or doesn't informally go to, let's say, a book presentation on a Greek topic, then it's very difficult to know about. I mean, you know that they're out there, but it's difficult to measure them, as you're saying.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'd like to, picking up on that a little bit, although this isn't one of the questions that were originally submitted. My impression is that immigration basically coming from Greece is pretty much trickled down to very little. In other words, there may be some out migration. There may be some people who came from Greece, they're here and they're going back to Greece. So, from the point of view of assimilation as opposed to non-assimilation and maintaining this ethnic Greek presence, some people would say an ethnic Greek ghetto mentality. How do we look at what Peter was talking about with respect to the growth of the church? Now, statistics that I've seen, and I think they've even been reported by the Greek Archdiocese, is that the church is not growing. The church is not growing. I've even seen statistics that 90% of the people presently living in the United States that have any Greek background, one great papuli or something, are no longer members of the church. So do you have any comments about the impact of maintaining this Greek community and the growth of the church in this country?
I think that, yeah, I was struck by that 90%. I saw it in the question. That is a huge percentage, and I would want to try and examine that, because it seems to me to be too much. But that's not the point. I think the point is well taken, that that the Greek element is the Greek Americans. A huge percentage of the Greek Americans do not attend church, or maybe attend church, whatever it is, during the Easter and Christmas maybe. And I think that statistic, that trend, I think, away from Orthodoxy, if it is that a high percentage, I think is a very, very serious development. I think the Greek Americans who identify themselves ethnically are going to steadily erode. And And I think this is something the OCL should be discussing. What do we do to pick up the slack? Because the Greek or Greek Americans are going in a different direction. So what does Greek Orthodoxy do?
Yeah, and that, of course, that I think has been the subject of a lot of the conferences and the studies that the Orthodox Christian laity has been engaging in, which have always talked about the church being pan-Orthodox, being about all the Orthodox in America are one faith. And so trying to bring together the 14 ethnic jurisdictions into one church, and you mentioned canonical, but everybody agrees that it's uncanonical to have 4 or 5 bishops in the same city. So I'm not a canonist either, but I know that from that part of it, the idea behind the Assembly of Bishops that was endorsed by the mother churches that's been meeting for 10 years is to come up with a plan on how to create one Orthodox church in America. But on the point of the tension between the Greek community and the Orthodox community, one of the questions that we had was that many Orthodox Christians in America believe that the Greek government, the Church of Greece, and the Ecumenical Patriarchate use the Greek Orthodox Church in America to advance their political interests rather than allowing the church to grow as an indigenous, missionary, multi-ethnic American Orthodox Church. From your study of the GOA of the Archdiocese, how do you respond to that type of a criticism?
I think I would rephrase the question and then agree with it. I would rephrase it, scaling it down. So first of all, I haven't found any evidence about actual involvement in the affairs of the Greek Church is neither here nor there, because if you're smart enough, you don't leave a paper trail if you're doing those things. But it seems to me that the Greek government looks upon the concern of the Greek government is preserving Hellenism, in other words, the presence of Greeks abroad, because it sees Greece or the Greeks as having a global existence. To that, and with that goal in mind, it sees the church as one of the several agencies, one of the several vehicles which will help the preservation, or maybe the preservation, of Hellenism abroad. So in that sense, it supports the church and it pushes it in that direction without necessarily trying to interfere in the internal affairs. There was one moment which was pretty obvious to me that they were interfering, was when Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew wanted to dismiss Iakovos, and of all people, Andreas Papandreou, who was prime minister in Athens, the socialist prime minister, who had a very rocky relationship with Iakovos for several years, was actually they were actually asking the Ecumenical Patriarch to delay, because there were some negotiations going on at the United Nations about Greece or Cyprus or the Aegean. So I think that the government doesn't necessarily interfere in the affairs, but it sees the church as an ethnic vehicle and does all it can to help it along that way.
So again, getting back to some of the questions that we had in our submitted by some of our members. One of the questions was this new charter. The Ecumenical Patriarchate imposed a new charter back in 2003, which was a controversy because there were a lot of the people here said that you don't have a right to do it unilaterally. It has to be done in consultation with the clergy laity in Congress here. But now he's just announced that he suspended that charter and he's going to impose a new charter. So based upon what you've seen, what changes do you expect to see? With a new Archbishop, there'll be the photos, and now we have a new charter coming.
So my immediate reaction, and I'm still sticking to my immediate reaction, is that it may be a return to the status quo ante. In other words, back to 1996 so I'll explain what I mean. After, in the late 90s, the ecumenical patriarch broke up the Archdiocese of North and South America. I don't think we're going back to that, but he gave all the power to the Metropolitans. And maybe my reaction to thinking, he's going to take away a lot of the autonomy of the Metropolitans was that anecdotally, I used to hear in and out as I did my research, everyone complaining that Archbishop Dimitrios couldn't do anything because the Metropolitans were acting as if they had fiefdoms, quote unquote. Those were the terms that were being used. So it seems to me that we may be going back to strengthening the position of the Archbishop. I think Archbishop Iakovos was so powerful that Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew was very worried about recreating another Iakovos, but now I think we're going to have a strong Archbishop, but the key element is that he's very closely associated with the Ecumenical Patriarch. He's not his rival as Iakovos was.
Yes, that brings to mind when we met with the Archbishop. Of course, we Americans, we don't understand all these different phraseologies, so when we met with Archbishop Ilpiloforos after he first arrived, one of us asked the question, we said, we don't understand how you can have an archdiocese with no diocese and an archbishop with no bishops. And he kind of smiled, because I think you're absolutely spot on that you by making metropolitans out of these bishops, you basically diminish the role of the archbishop to New York and Washington, D.C., that little territory. So it may be that he has more trust in Ilpiloforos, who has not had a long history in the United States, as opposed to Iakovos, who has spent so many years here. So I think you're probably right as to what may be coming. I'd like to talk a little bit about, because there's two different ways of looking at diaspora, I guess. The ethnic diaspora, because those that are involved with OCL look back at and I don't know if you saw the statements that were made by the bishops when they met at Ligonier, which may have been one of the reasons why Iakovos was kind of forced to retire. But they issued a statement basically saying that the church in America is not in a diaspora. And the idea of a diaspora is a place where people are here only temporarily and they're going to go back. And I'm not sure how many of the members of our archdiocese even, including those that only come, at Easter and Christmas and so on and so forth, how many of them really look at themselves as being in a diaspora? In other words, hearkening to go back to the homeland, maybe that. And you've done a lot of stuff on sociology. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yes. So the striking thing for me is that the church has a very clear definition of diaspora, but the secular authorities in Greece do not. The Greek state talks about, they call it diaspora, then they call it homogenia, then they call it apodimos, Hellenismos, various different type of terms which denote something different, but no one really bothers to think in terms of getting a consistent term out because they don't really want to think it through. And second, I have to say that I believe that the Greek government and the Greek state much of the time are paying lip service to the idea that there is a global Hellenism and a global diaspora. As most Greek Americans will tell you, or at least I think they would, they like taking, they want the support, but they don't really offer much back. And efforts to coordinate, such as the Council of the Greeks Abroad, turned out to be a fiasco, because it wasn't, it may have been an excellent theory on paper, but it was a disaster. So I think the Greek state doesn't define diaspora very well. However, sociologically, again, we can say that the present era that we live in has strengthened or legitimized people thinking of themselves as diaspora because of the end of the Cold War, of multiculturalism, of technology, of travel, of global connectivity, which is an awful term, but because that exists, yes, and that enables people to think of themselves as a diaspora. So there's an irony here, of course, because I think the Greek state could spend much more time in getting itself organized and mobilizing these Greeks abroad who identify themselves as diaspora, but it doesn't. And it's left up to them, and they have varied views of that. So, but that still leaves us with the irony that the church has a much clearer view than the Greek state. So I wouldn't misunderstand when the Greeks go on and on about, oh, there's a Greek diaspora. Yeah, but it's rhetorical half the time.
I think that brings us to, we have one of the questions that was submitted was about the writings that you've done about the Asia Minor refugees in Greece and their assimilation into Greek society, as well as the efforts of many of these prosoras to retain their homeland identities. And in the article, you concluded that the dual effects of globalization and multiculturalism provided the diaspora groups with a new lease of life. I think that's what you're referring to here. But the Greek migration to the U.S., especially in the later from 1966 on, and the Asia Minor refugees arriving from Greece in 1923 are very different. I mean, ones were refugees, the other were voluntarily coming here. But do you see any parallels in the history of the archdiocese and the impact of this globalization, multiculturalism, in providing the diasporists among the GOA with a new lease on life? I think Charlie Moscow's talked about it, the rearguard actions of the diasporists, the ones that are trying to hold on to their Greek identity. Of course, he thought that maybe you see that differently too than Dr. Moscow.
Yes, rearguard. Yes, I think I have the rearguard I identify as bigger and stronger, and I'll say for 2 or 3 reasons. I think there's a Greek specificity in terms of which encourages this feeling of diaspora. That is, first of all, that Greece still has its so-called national problems, national issues. The fact that its borders are challenged by Turkey. It's not quite as in a precarious situation as Israel considers itself to be and is, but there are still the issue of Cyprus, the issue of the Aegean animates, awakens some ethnicity there, which wouldn't be the case with Italian Americans, because no one, of course, is challenging either Italy's existence or Italy's islands or their borders. So that's the one thing. The other thing is, I think, ancient Greek civilization, historically, the Greek immigrants have kind of piggybacked on the idea that the Americans see themselves as heirs of ancient Greece. So by claiming ancestry, by claiming a connection with ancient Greece, you can start talking about Hellenism and Americanism is the same thing. The stuff that Ahepa was talking about in the 1920s and 1930s. But I do believe being Greek. Whether it's true or not is another issue, but it gives you that. So those two elements. So I think there's the rear guard is animated by two things that maybe other ethnic groups are not.
Well, of course, OCL is interested in promoting orthodoxy and growing the church, and in bringing together all the jurisdictions. So the issue is whether or not this emphasis on ethnicity is really helping people like Peter Zaris, who says, I had to leave the church because I didn't understand. And we have even Iakovos, as you indicated, had indicated that the more and more English should be used in the liturgies. People don't really understand it. Even the Greeks from Greece, I don't think understand. Maybe those do, but certainly Greek Americans. If you ask a Greek, what does homogenia mean, or what does homoousion mean, or any of these words that are used in the creed, they wouldn't have a clue. So the issue that OCL, of course, is interested in is how do we not only preserve the church in America, but how do we make it grow? How do we bring together the various jurisdictions into one church, first of all, and at the same time have it open to the children who are marrying non-Greeks or the people who don't understand Greek. So that's been our goal, and I wonder if you'd like to comment on the use of English, for instance, in the liturgy and so on and so forth.
I was so impressed with Archbishop Iakovos. I think it's Denver in 1964 when he starts talking about the need to include English in the liturgy, and then he does so more explicitly in 1970. And he does it in the wrong place. He does it in New York, where all those Greek language media exist. And it becomes a furor of opposition, which is, it's almost comical. And I've actually spoken to a couple of people who were critics of Iakovos, including the late Mr. Peter Makrias, Panayotis Makrias, who worked for the National Herald and then produced the Nea Yorki magazine and Estiator magazine, and he's admitted that they were wrong. But of course he did, too late. It seemed the obvious thing in 1970. And my interpretation of this fixation of some people with language, with a Greek language, is again, I think Greek identity is very big on identifying with the Greek language. And therefore, taking away the Greek language hits people mentally very deeply because they feel that they're losing some kind of cornerstone of their identity. And yes, they're sitting in the liturgy and they can't understand what is being said. And they're complaining about English. And it's a meta thing. It's almost like a sense that it connects them in a nostalgic way to Greece or their parents or their grandparents or something. It's very difficult to identify. And, maybe the way I would go forward would be to retain some Greek as a way of gesturing towards this visceral feeling and then do everything else in English. From the outside, it's obvious.
Well, certainly, there have been observations that whatever language the liturgy is the priests use in the liturgy, the sermon and the announcements are always in English because they know the things they want to make sure that you understand are in English. It's interesting you talked about the Denver Clergy Lady Congress because that was where the so-called 5 points of Denver were authorized. When Iakovos said, "Well, you can do the epistle reading, the gospel reading, the sermon, and a couple others. They can be done in English as well as Greek." And then, as you get into some parishes that have become more and more all English, the immigrants the more recent immigrants come in and they say, well, now we want those parts to be done in Greek in addition. So if you're in a parish where the sermon is always in English, they say, well, we'd like to hear a Greek sermon. If you have only the epistle and the gospel in English, we want to hear it in Greek. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I'm not sure that I have, some of these questions really deal with OCL and its attempt to bring the church together and to grow Orthodoxy as an American and an indigenous American Orthodox church that is not looking back to Serbia or Romania or Greece or these various other countries, and that's the mission of OCL. So I don't know if anybody else has any questions, or David. We've gone over quite a bit. I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us.
Thank you.
David,
No.
do you have any questions?
I don't have
That have
any
come in?
myself. I don't see any in the chat. If anyone would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself or put it in the chat and we'll bring it to Professor Alexander.
Yeah, hi. This is Gail Wallace, Jack. I'm sorry, I'm driving, so I can't put my video on. I had one question about a very small text that was in the book about Iakovos when he was, doing the Great March in Selma, which we all is held up so much. And there was a comment that many of the Greeks forgot that they had been persecuted by the Ku Klux Klan. Could you talk about that? Because I didn't know that part of history at all.
Oh, yes. The arrival of the Greeks in the early 20th century coincided with a period of xenophobia and nativism, which remained quite strong through the 1920s and up to the early 30s. The Ku Klux Klan had been pretty much effective at crushing civil rights protests on the part of the Greek Americans, but they were very much against the Southeast Europeans, including the Greek Americans, and especially the Catholics. And parenthetically, there was a confusion because the Greek Orthodox Church calls it Catholic Church as well. And you see sometimes people confusing the two. So the Greeks were victimized during that period. And that's why AHEPA was established in 1922 to encourage the Greeks to speak English, to take on American ways of behaving, and to adopt American citizenship. Needless to say, Iakovos's brave gesture in going down to Selma and marching next to Martin Luther King was not representative of a community that by that time had become part of the mainstream, had become conservative, had become wealthy thanks to the upward social mobility. And most Greek Americans, including many in the South, were horrified that Iakovos was doing what he was doing, because they had nightmares of maybe that old persecution returning in some way. And they were very upset with him. But he went forward and has, gave the Greek Orthodox Church one of its most important moments and inspirational moments. I wasn't familiar with the issue of the evangelicals and the Greek government, but I think it all goes back to, for me, the most important moment in the history of the Greek Orthodox Church is the arrival of Athinagoras in 1931, when the church is almost in warring factions between different political factions in Greece. And Athinagoras comes, all those divisions are swept aside because of his authority and the pressure from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Church of Greece, and the Greek government. Everyone And Athenagoras makes this huge decision that the local parish will supplant the community organization. And by doing so, it won't be governed by the community, it will be governed by itself. The parish will govern the community organization. And that means that the parish is going to take over everything. It takes over the schools, the Greek language, not only the Sunday schools, but the Greek language schools, the philanthropical organizations, a number of other activities. It takes over all these functions, which in other diaspora communities, among the Greeks in Egypt, for instance, it's not the church that runs the schools, although it has a couple of churches. It's the wealthy Greeks who run the community. And the church does what you just said, the missionary work. But in America, historically, things turned out differently. And that's the legacy of the past, that the church took on all these activities which were at that time associated with what was a first-generation immigrant community, and it's still doing it. You know, when I hear that people complain, when I hear the National Herald complaining that another Greek school, another church-run Greek school is going to close, I think, you know, but you know, it's not that necessarily the church's responsibility. The Greek state should come in and fund the Greek schools. But of course, the Greek state won't do that because it's convenient that if you've got someone else running their schools. So I'm going back to Athenagoras and taking over all those activities that I think this is what we're still dealing with.
I don't think we have any more questions at this point. I'd like to thank Professor Kitroeff for very enlightening 2 hours, and especially for the book that I urge all of our listeners and others. I think we have it on our website. It's an excellent history of the Archdiocese. And we will probably go on and talk about some of the other things that OCL is involved with respect to growing the church as opposed to maintaining the Greek homogeneia in the United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to OCL for being what it is, and for being so interested in the book. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, George, and all of our listeners. And have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone. Okay.
Great.
Good night. Thank you.
Right.